It's not hard to imagine that scene. You're standing on a shoreline. The sea stretches out in front of you, wide, deep, impossible. And behind you, dust is rising in the distance. You hear the rumble of chariots getting closer. People are shouting. Panic is spreading through the camp. Just days ago, you were celebrating freedom at last. After generations of slavery, you're among those who were walking away from Egypt towards a new life with God. But now, it feels like everything has gone wrong. The sea in front of you, the army behind you, nowhere to go. And someone says what maybe people are already thinking. Why did we ever leave Egypt? Why did we ever? It's a question to which I am sure we could each fill in our own personal ending. Why did we ever think this was a good idea? I'm sure we've all had moments like that. We take a step that seems right. Maybe it's a new job, a new responsibility, a difficult decision we believed God was leading us into. And then things get harder instead of easier. And we begin to question, did I make a mistake? Did we make a mistake? And that's exactly where the people of Israel find themselves. Just a short time earlier, they had celebrated their first Passover. Inside their homes in Egypt, as we talked about last week, the lamb had been sacrificed. Blood was brushed across the doorposts as a sign that they trusted God and belonged to Him. And through that night, God's mercy meant that they were spared the suffering of a devastating plague that would claim the firstborn of so many. And that night was the beginning of their freedom. But it was also the beginning of their new journey. Because being rescued by God is one thing, learning to trust Him is another. And that lesson began almost immediately, because the route that they were asked to take by Moses, by God, was one that left them vulnerable and seemingly trapped at the edge of the sea. And so when Pharaoh's army appears, it's not hard to imagine how that fear would spread quickly. And people turn on Moses. And they say, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us here to die? You can always hear the sarcasm in their voices. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians. Think about that. Slavery and the kind of oppression that had been crying out to God for relief suddenly seems better than the freedom they longed for when they get to this crunch point where things are difficult. They want to go back into what was unhealthy rather than move forward into what is liberating. And that's what fear can do to us if we're not careful. Fear can have a strange way of rewriting the past. When the future feels uncertain and scary, when we feel as though it is game over for a way forward, we begin to remember the past as safer or better than it really was. People stay in unhealthy situations because they're familiar. We cling to old habits because change feels risky. We sometimes prefer what we know, even when it's ultimately not good for us. And there's something even more challenging in this story. This wasn't a wrong turn. God had led them to this point. That cloud by day and that fire by night led them to that route where they were. But God had told Moses that Pharaoh will pursue them. In other words, this moment didn't surprise God, and it shouldn't have surprised Moses or the people. Maybe some of us need to remember that this morning. God knows your circumstances, and He knows how to lead you in them and through them. And maybe it's not just for your own well-being. Because God's not only rescuing Israel from Egypt. As we mentioned before, this is about God revealing Himself, who He is, how He can be trusted. And He's forming a people who are to become a light to the nations. Isaiah speaks of that years later. For generations they had lived under Pharaoh's power. Pharaoh's word was law. Pharaoh's armies were unstoppable. But now they're discovering something else. God is stronger than Pharaoh, and they're about to see it with their own eyes. So into the middle of that chaos, Moses speaks the words that breathe life and hope if they are heard and received. And he says this, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will see the deliverance that the Lord will bring you today." And then he goes on to add, "The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still." Imagine hearing that. The army is approaching. The sea is still there. Nothing has changed yet. And Moses says to them, "Stand still and trust." That goes against every instinct that we have as human beings who want to do something. Whether it's to lash out at the one we blame for getting us into the apparent mess, as they did with Moses, or to surrender and go back to being a slave to try and save your life. It's crunch time. Who do you trust? We're not actually told their response, only that Moses hears God speaking and then saying, "Tell the people to move forward." Forward? There's still a sea in the way. And that's the moment where faith really hits the road. It's trusting God before you can see the way through, because God's already at work here. Before the sea opens, there's something else that happens. The pillar of cloud that had been leading the people suddenly moves. It shifts position and goes behind them. And remember, that's symbolic of God's presence. God is between Israel and the Egyptian army. And all night long, that cloud remains there. For the Egyptians, it's pitch black. They cannot see a thing. For Israel, it's light. Before God opens a path through the sea, he places himself between his people and their danger. In other words, the first act of deliverance is not the miracle of the parting of the sea or the wind of God that enabled it. It is God's presence. God saying to them, "You're not alone." And that might be something that somebody here needs to hear today. Sometimes we want God to solve the situation immediately, but often his first gift is something else. His presence with us in the middle of it. How do we recognize his presence? What is God revealing of himself at this point? Well, there's something really important. If you look at the contrast between the leader of the Egyptians and the leader of the Israelites, Pharaoh drives his people and uses them. God leads his people and frees them. Pharaoh uses power, pressure, fear. His chariots pursue the Israelites relentlessly. But God does something different. He guides them out of bondage. He protects them in the challenges. He invites them to move forward into freedom. Pharaoh's leadership produces panic. God's leadership invites trust. And so then the wind begins to blow all night long. Slowly the waters divide, and what looked like a dead end becomes a road, and the people walk through the sea on dry ground. The place that looked like the end of the journey becomes the doorway into freedom. It's the moment when the people of Israel learn something they could never have learned any other way after all that they've been through. God is faithful. God is trustworthy. God is able to do immeasurably more than we can ask, think, or imagine. God's heart is to see his people free to flourish and to be a blessing to others. And God can make a way where there is no way. That leads us to Jesus, to the one who comes to set the captives free. Paul tells us that this passing through the sea was like baptism, the moment when an old life ends and a new life begins. And ultimately, that greatest moment is at the cross. At the cross, it looked as though the story had reached the dead end. Jesus had been faithful, yet the road led to suffering and death. But in the resurrection, God opened a way through death itself, and what looked like defeat became victory. What looked like the end became the beginning. Most of us won't stand at the edge of a sea with an army behind us, but we all face moments when the future feels as though it's slipping away. A diagnosis, a broken relationship, a difficult decision, a season when we honestly don't know what comes next. And we have a choice. Will we trust the one who knows the way? In those moments, as I've said, we want God to show us the whole path, but he often does something different. He just asks us to trust him for the next step. And sometimes that step comes before the path is visible. And sometimes that next step is something totally unexpected and totally amazing. Something that takes our breath away and leaves us knowing without a shadow of a doubt, only God could have done this. Because the God who saved his people at Passover, the God who stood between them and danger, the God who made a road through the sea, is still the God who leads his people today. He's still the God who invites us to trust him, to move from darkness to light, to move from captivity to freedom, to entrust him, to enable us to become the kind of people that will be a blessing and a witness to his grace and glory to others. Amen.